The spotlight cuts through the darkness of Carnegie Hall like a blade through silk. Terrence Brooks stands frozen at the edge of the stage, his weathered hands trembling at his sides. Before him, 2,800 people rise to their feet in thunderous applause, and he hasn't even touched the piano yet. 3 months ago, this man was sleeping under a highway overpass in Philadelphia, his only possession, a tattered sleeping bag that smelled of rain and regret. 3 months ago, the world had forgotten Terrence Brooks existed. 3 months ago, he had forgotten himself. But on this November evening, in one of the most prestigious concert halls on Earth, something impossible is about to happen. The question isn't whether Terrence will play. The question is, how did a homeless man with calloused fingers and broken dreams find his way to this moment? And the answer begins not with triumph, but with tragedy. Terrence Brooks first touched a piano at the age of 4 in a small church in West Philadelphia. His grandmother, a woman who cleaned houses 6 days a week, noticed something extraordinary in the way his tiny fingers found the keys. She saved for 2 years to buy him lessons. By age 7, he was playing Chopin. By 12, he was performing Mozart concertos that made grown musicians weep. In 1998, at 18 years old, Terrence received a full scholarship to the Juilliard School in New York City. The letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, and his grandmother held it to her chest and cried tears of joy that fell on the same hands that had scrubbed other people's floors to make this moment possible. She died 6 months later, but not before seeing her grandson walk through the doors of one of the most prestigious music schools in the world. At Juilliard, Terrence didn't just study music, he became it. His professors marveled at the emotional depth he brought to every piece, the way he could make a piano sing with sorrow or explode with joy. He graduated summa cum laude in 2002, and the world opened before him like sheet music waiting to be played. Concert halls from Boston to San Francisco wanted him. Recording contracts were discussed. The New York Times called him a generational talent with fingers that speak the language of the divine. In 2005, Terrence married Alicia Thompson, a fellow musician who played the violin with the same passion he brought to the piano. Their wedding was small, but filled with music that made the guests forget where they were transported by the beauty of two souls, harmonizing in perfect rhythm. In 2012, their son Caleb was born, and Terrence discovered a love that transcended even music. Caleb had his father's eyes and his grandmother's smile. At 7 years old, he was just beginning to show interest in the piano, his small hands reaching for the keys the same way his father's had done decades before. Terrence would sit beside him at their upright piano in their Brooklyn apartment, guiding those tiny fingers through simple melodies, his heart swelling with a pride his own grandmother would have recognized. And then, on a rainy October evening in 2019, everything ended. The drunk driver ran a red light at the intersection of Atlantic and Flatbush Avenue at 47 miles per hour. Terrence was driving. Caleb was in the back seat, chattering about a song he wanted to learn, his voice bright with the excitement of a child who believed the world was safe and parents were invincible. The impact came from the passenger side. The sound of crunching metal and shattering glass was the last thing Terrence heard before darkness swallowed everything. He woke up 3 days later in a hospital bed, his body broken but healing. But Alicia sat beside him, her face a mask of devastation that no music could ever capture. She didn't need to speak. He saw it in her eyes. Caleb was gone. The funeral was held on a Tuesday, the same day of the week Terrence had received his Juilliard acceptance letter 21 years earlier. He stood at the small casket, his hands bandaged from the accident, and something inside him shattered in a way that would never heal. He couldn't cry. He couldn't speak. He could only stand there, a hollow shell where a man used to be. The police report said the other driver had a blood alcohol level 3 times the legal limit. He survived with minor injuries. He was charged, tried, and sentenced to 8 years in prison. None of it mattered. No amount of justice could bring back the sound of Caleb's laughter, the feeling of those small hands reaching for the piano keys, the future that had been stolen in a single moment of someone else's selfishness. Terrence never touched a piano again. The PTSD came first, turning sleep into a battleground of twisted metal and screaming, and the moment of impact replaying endlessly. Then came the depression, a weight so heavy he could barely lift his head from the pillow. He started drinking to numb the pain, vodka, at first, then anything he could find. Alicia tried to help, tried to hold on, but grief had made him a stranger. 6 months after Caleb's death, she moved out. The divorce papers arrived by mail. He lost his teaching position at the Brooklyn Conservatory when he stopped showing up. Lost the apartment when he couldn't pay rent. Lost friends who tried to help, but eventually gave up when he pushed them away with the aggression of a wounded animal. By the spring of 2020, Terrence Brooks, the Juilliard prodigy who had once commanded standing ovations, was living on the streets of Philadelphia, the city of his birth, sleeping under the I-95 overpass with nothing but a sleeping bag and memories that cut like broken glass. The underside of the I-95 overpass became home. The constant rumble of traffic overhead was the only music Terrence allowed himself, now a mechanical rhythm that required nothing of him, no emotion, no memory, no pain. He shared the space with 17 other people whose lives had also come undone, though their stories were different. There was Raymond, a 62-year-old veteran whose nightmares were older than Terrence's. There was Monica, a woman in her 40s who had fled domestic violence with nothing but the clothes on her back. There was Danny, barely 20, who aged out of foster care and had nowhere else to go. They formed a strange kind of family bound not by blood, but by the shared understanding that the world had forgotten them. They watched out for each other, shared food when they had it huddled together when winter came, and the cold bit through their layers of donated clothing like teeth through skin. Terrence spent his days in a fog of survival. He panhandled at the corner of Market and Broad, holding a cardboard sign that said, "Homeless Vet," even though he'd never served in the military because he'd learned that sign brought more money than the truth. He ate at the soup kitchen on Arch Street on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He avoided mirrors because he couldn't bear to see what he'd become, the way his face had hollowed out, the way his eyes had gone dead. Music was everywhere in the city, impossible to escape. Street performers with guitars, car radios blasting the distant sound of someone practicing scales in an apartment window. Every note was a knife wound. He would plug his ears and walk faster, trying to outrun the sound, trying to outrun the memories of Caleb's small voice asking, "Daddy, can you teach me that song?" At night, lying on cardboard under the overpass, listening to the endless traffic above, Terrence sometimes looked at his hands. They were still there, fingers that had once danced across ivory keys with the precision of a surgeon and the passion of a poet. But they were different now, calloused from life on the streets, dirty under the nails, trembling from alcohol withdrawal. These weren't the hands of a pianist. These were the hands of a ghost. The other residents of the overpass knew nothing of his past. He never told them about Juilliard or Carnegie Hall, or the New York Times review that once called him exceptional. He never mentioned Caleb. To them, he was just Terry, the quiet one, who didn't talk much, who sometimes muttered in his sleep, who drank when he could afford it, and stared into space when he couldn't. 5 years passed this way. 5 years of forgetting, of running, of slowly dying, while his heart kept beating out of cruel habit. 5 years of believing that Terrence Brooks, the pianist, was as dead as his son. And then came the piano in the alley. November in Philadelphia arrives with cold rain and early darkness. On this particular evening, the rain fell in sheets that turned the streets into rivers of reflected light, neon signs and car headlights bleeding into puddles that looked like portals to another world. Terrence was looking for shelter somewhere drier than the overpass, where the rain found ways through the concrete to drip on sleeping bags and faces. He'd heard about an abandoned warehouse near the old theater district, a place where the homeless sometimes sheltered when winter came early. He made his way through the rain-soaked alleys, his jacket soaked through his teeth chattering. That's when he saw it. Behind the shuttered Walnut Street Theater, in an alley that smelled of garbage and rainwater, someone had abandoned an upright piano. It sat against the brick wall like a monument to forgotten dreams, its dark wood warped from weather exposure, its ivory keys yellowed and cracked. Rain drummed against its closed lid, creating a percussion that sounded almost musical in the darkness. Terrence stopped walking. He should have kept going, should have found shelter, should have done anything except stand there in the rain, staring at this instrument that had no business being in an alley, this relic of a world he'd left behind. But his feet wouldn't move. The piano seemed to pulse in the darkness, drawing him closer. He could see water damage on its sides, could see where the veneer had peeled away, could see the neglect that had brought it to this place, discarded and forgotten. Just like him. His hand reached out before his mind could stop it, fingers touching the wood, feeling the reality of it. The surface was cold and wet, but underneath was the unmistakable solidity of an instrument that had once made music. His breath caught in his throat. His hands began to tremble, but not from the cold. No. No. He pulled his hand back as if burned. Memories crashed over him like the rain, unbidden and unwelcome. Caleb at the piano, his little legs swinging because he couldn't reach the pedals yet. Alicia playing violin while Terrence accompanied her, their instruments weaving together like their lives once did. His grandmother's face the first time she heard him play Pride and Love, shining in eyes that had seen too much hardship. And underneath it all, the memory that never stopped cutting Caleb's voice in the car, talking about a song excited and alive seconds before the impact that ended everything. Terrence turned to walk away. He made it 3 steps. Then he heard it. Not a sound exactly. More like an absence of sound, a silence that demanded to be filled. The rain continued its percussion on the piano lid, and in that rhythm, Terrence heard something he hadn't heard in 5 years. He heard possibility. His hands were shaking violently now. His heart hammered against his ribs. Every instinct screamed at him to run to get away from this instrument and everything it represented. Music had been his life, and music had been there when his life ended. Touching this piano would be like touching the third rail electrocution by memory. But something stronger than fear pulled at him. Maybe it was the rain. Maybe it was the darkness. Maybe it was 5 years of numbness cracking like ice in spring. Maybe it was the simple fact that he was so tired of running from the only thing he'd ever truly loved. Terrence Brooks lifted the piano lid. The hinges groaned rusty from weather and neglect. Inside, the strings were still there, tarnished but intact. The hammers were worn but present. The keys yellowed and cracked as they were weighted in their familiar pattern, black and white, 88 opportunities to create or destroy. He stood there for a long time, rain soaking through his clothes, running down his face like tears he could no longer cry. His fingers hovered over the keys, not quite touching, suspended in the space between silence and sound. And then, without deciding to, without planning it, without even fully wanting it, Terrence Brooks let his right index finger fall. Middle C. The note rang out in the alley, pure and clear, despite the piano's condition, despite the rain, despite the 5 years since he'd last heard this sound. It echoed off the brick walls, mixing with the rain's percussion, creating a moment of unexpected beauty in a forgotten place. Terrence gasped. The sound went through him like electricity, like grief, like coming home after being lost in a wilderness so vast he'd forgotten what home looked like. His whole body shook with the weight of that single note, that simple vibration of a string struck by a hammer, that fundamental building block of everything he'd once been. His other fingers found the keys. He didn't plan what to play. His hands moved of their own accord, muscle memory awakening after years of forced sleep. The opening notes of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata emerged from the battered piano, halting at first, the timing uncertain, his fingers remembering the patterns even as his mind struggled to catch up. And Terrence Brooks began to cry. The Moonlight Sonata is a piece about longing, about sorrow, about the aching beauty of something lost and remembered. Beethoven wrote it for a woman he loved, but couldn't have, pouring his heart into notes that would outlive them both. Every pianist knows this piece. Every pianist has played it. But on that rainy November evening in a Philadelphia alley, Terrence Brooks didn't just play it. He lived it. His fingers moved across the cracked keys with increasing confidence, 5 years of absence falling away like chains breaking. The first movement unfolded in its gentle, mournful rhythm, each note a confession, each phrase a prayer. The rain continued to fall, but Terrence no longer felt it. He was somewhere else now, somewhere beyond the alley and the overpass and the 5 years of trying to forget. He played for Caleb, though he didn't realize it at first. He played for his grandmother, who had believed in him when he was just a child making noise. He played for Alicia and their broken marriage. He played for Professor Hartman at Juilliard, who had once told him that true artists don't play music, they bleed it. He played for himself, for the man he used to be, for the man he'd tried to kill with vodka and silence and deliberate forgetting. The alley began to fill with people. At first, just one. A woman named Emily Roberts, 34 years old. A third-grade teacher at Greenfield Elementary was cutting through the alley on her way home from a parent-teacher conference. She'd had a long day, her feet hurt, and she was thinking about nothing more profound than the leftover pasta waiting in her refrigerator. Then she heard the music. She stopped mid-step, frozen by the sound of a piano playing in an alley where no piano should be. She turned toward the source and saw him, this man in ragged clothes, soaking wet, bent over a battered upright piano like he was trying to crawl inside it. And the music he was creating, my God, the music. Emily had taken piano lessons as a child and quit after 3 years, frustrated by her lack of talent. But she knew enough to recognize when someone was doing something extraordinary. This wasn't just playing. This was something else entirely, something raw and real, and so achingly beautiful it hurt to hear. She pulled out her phone. By the time she started recording, Terrence was deep into the second movement, the tempo increasing, the technical difficulty escalating, his fingers dancing across keys that hadn't been tuned in years, but somehow still sang. The video captured it all: the rain falling in sheets, the dark alley, the abandoned piano, and this man, this homeless man, with no audience except the night itself, playing like his life depended on it, because it did. 2 more people stopped. Then 5. Then a dozen. Word spread the way it does in cities, someone texting a friend. "You have to see this," someone calling out to a passerby. "Listen." Within 20 minutes, 37 people had gathered in that alley, standing in the rain, watching a miracle unfold. They were silent, these unexpected witnesses. No one spoke. No one wanted to break the spell. A lawyer, still in his suit from court, stood next to a construction worker with concrete dust on his boots. A mother held her sleeping infant against her chest. A teenage boy paused his music and removed his headphones for the first time in weeks. All of them from different worlds, drawn together by the universal language that needs no translation. Terrence played for 43 minutes straight. The Moonlight Sonata was followed by Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat, then Debussy's Clair de Lune. His fingers found the music like a man finding water after days in the desert, desperate and grateful, and unable to stop. The rain continued, and the crowd grew, and the impossible became real. When he finally stopped, his hands shaking with exhaustion, his chest heaving, his face wet with rain, and tears, he could no longer distinguish Terrence. Brooks looked up for the first time and saw them. Saw the people gathered in the alley, saw their faces illuminated by phone screens and streetlights, saw the tears on their cheeks and the wonder in their eyes. The crowd erupted in applause. It started tentative, one person clapping, then another, then a wave of sound that built and built until it rivaled the rain itself. They clapped and cheered, and some of them cried, these strangers who had stumbled into grace, who had witnessed something that would stay with them forever. Terrence stood up from the piano bench, staggering, slightly disoriented by the sudden return to reality. He looked at his hands as if seeing them for the first time, these instruments that had just betrayed his 5-year vow of silence. And then he ran. He pushed through the crowd, mumbling apologies, and disappeared into the rain-soaked streets, leaving the piano behind, leaving the applause behind, leaving everything behind except the terrible knowledge that he could still feel, could still create, could still bleed music into the world. The crowd slowly dispersed, still talking in hushed, amazed voices about what they'd just experienced. Most of them went home and told their families about the homeless man who played piano like an angel. Some of them wondered if they'd dreamed it. But Emily Roberts didn't go home. She stood in the rain, looking at the video on her phone, watching it back, making sure it was real. 3 minutes and 47 seconds of footage. The angle was shaky, the lighting poor, the audio distorted by rain and distance, but the music came through. The emotion came through. The impossible beauty of it came through. She opened TikTok, typed a caption with trembling fingers, and pressed upload, found a homeless man playing piano in an alley. This is the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. Philadelphia. Can we find this person and help him? Find the pianist. Philly streets music heals. Then she walked home unaware that she had just changed the world. The video uploaded at 9:47 p.m. Eastern Time on a Thursday evening. For the first hour, nothing happened. Emily checked it obsessively while eating her pasta, watching the view count tick up slowly. 23 views, 41 views, 68 views. Then, at 11:13 p.m., something shifted. A music teacher in Baltimore shared it with her students. A classical music enthusiast in Chicago reposted it with the caption, "This man is playing Beethoven like I've never heard it played." A sound engineer in Los Angeles cleaned up the audio and reshared it. The algorithm noticed. The platform's mysterious machinery, always hungry for content that makes people feel something, pushed the video into more feeds. By midnight, the video had 100,000 views. By 2:00 a.m., it had crossed 1 million. By the time Emily woke up Friday morning to the sound of her alarm, her video had been viewed 5.3 million times, and her phone was on fire with notifications. Comments poured in by the thousands, people from around the world, united in their awe and their questions. Who is this man? This is absolutely incredible. Someone please find him. I'm a professional pianist, and I'm not ashamed to say this made me weep. The way he plays, you can hear his whole soul in it. Philadelphia. We need to help this person. The hashtag #FindThePianist began trending. Local news stations picked up the story. By Friday afternoon, the video had crossed 20 million views and had been shared across every social media platform on Earth. It appeared on Reddit, where thousands of commenters debated the technical aspects of the performance. It went viral on Facebook, where it was shared by grandmothers and church groups. It exploded on Instagram, where musicians and celebrities reposted it with captions about the power of art. The mainstream media couldn't ignore it. CNN ran a segment Friday evening viral video of homeless pianist captivates millions. NBC. Philadelphia sent reporters to the alley, filming the piano, interviewing people from the neighborhood. ABC News featured it on their national broadcast. The Washington Post published an article titled "The Homeless Virtuoso, a Mystery Man, and the Music That Found Him." Music critics weighed in. Dr. Amanda Richardson, a musicologist at Boston University, told NPR, "What strikes me about this performance is the emotional authenticity. This isn't someone showing off technical skill. This is someone using music as a language when words have failed. It's raw and real in a way that formal performances often aren't." Professional pianists shared the video with reverence. Lang Lang, one of the world's most famous pianists, posted it on Instagram with the comment, "True artistry knows no boundaries. This man's performance reminds us why music matters." But amid all the attention, all the shares and comments and news coverage, one crucial piece was missing. No one knew who he was. The video showed only his hands, and his silhouette, rain and darkness obscuring his face. Emily, overwhelmed by the response, gave interviews explaining how she'd stumbled upon the performance, but she hadn't gotten his name, hadn't seen him clearly in the darkness. "I just heard the music," she told a local news reporter, "and it stopped me in my tracks. I've never heard anything like it." The search intensified. Find the Pianist dominated social media. People scoured Philadelphia looking in alleys and underpasses. Homeless advocacy groups shared the video hoping someone might recognize him. Musicians who had studied at Juilliard and Curtis analyzed the technique, trying to narrow down who might play with such distinctive emotional depth. Theories multiplied. Some suggested he was a former concert pianist who had fallen on hard times. Others thought he might be a music teacher who'd lost everything. A few cruel voices suggested it was all staged a publicity stunt, though the raw authenticity of the performance made that theory difficult to maintain. Meanwhile, 64 blocks away, under the I-95 overpass, Terrence Brooks had no idea any of this was happening. He'd returned to the underpass Thursday night, shaken by what he'd done by the breaking of his 5-year silence. he'd played. After swearing he never would again, after convincing himself that part of him was dead and buried with Caleb, he'd sat at that ruined piano and played like his hands had never forgotten, like his heart had just been waiting for permission to break open again. The other residents noticed his distress, but knew better than to pry. Monica offered him some soup from the thermos she'd gotten from the kitchen. Raymond sat nearby in companionable silence, understanding that sometimes the best help is just being present. Danny asked if he was okay, and Terrence nodded a lie. He didn't sleep Thursday night. He lay on his sleeping bag staring at the concrete above him, listening to traffic and distant sirens, his hands still trembling from muscle memory and emotion. Part of him wanted to run back to that alley to play again, to feel that terrifying aliveness that music had always given him. Part of him wanted to run in the opposite direction to find enough alcohol to drown the feelings that had resurfaced like bodies rising from deep water. Friday, he panhandled at his usual corner, but his mind was elsewhere. His fingers kept moving unconsciously, remembering the keys, the patterns, the muscle memory of decades. People dropped change in his cup, and he barely noticed. He was trying to understand what had happened, trying to reconcile the man who had sworn never to touch a piano again with the man whose hands had moved across those keys like they were coming home. Saturday brought rain again, and Terrence stayed under the overpass, huddled in his sleeping bag, listening to the water drip through the concrete. Each drop, a potential note, a potential beginning. He didn't know that his face was on every news channel rendered anonymous by darkness, but searched for by millions. He didn't know that the world was looking for him. He didn't know that 73 miles north in a small apartment in Manhattan, someone had just recognized him. Professor David Hartman was 72 years old and had taught piano at Juilliard for 48 years. He'd had hundreds of students, talented young people, who went on to respectable careers teaching music or performing in regional orchestras. He'd had dozens of exceptional students, those rare individuals who possessed not just skill, but artistry. And he'd had 3 students in his entire career who were touched by something beyond talent, something that approached genius. Terrence Brooks was one of them. Hartman had never forgotten him. Even after Terrence graduated in 2002 and went on to build a promising career, even after the tragedy that had shattered him, even after he'd disappeared from the music world entirely, Hartman remembered. He remembered a 20-year-old kid who could make a Steinway weep, who played with the emotional honesty that couldn't be taught, who understood instinctively that music wasn't about the notes on the page, but about the spaces between them where the soul lived. When Terrence disappeared after his son's death, Hartman had tried to find him. He'd called. He'd written letters. He'd reached out to Alicia, who'd told him gently that Terrence didn't want to be found, that he'd closed the door on music and everyone associated with it. Hartman had respected that boundary, but he'd never stopped wondering, never stopped hoping that somehow, someday, Terrence would find his way back. On Saturday morning, Hartman's granddaughter had shown him the viral video. "Grandpa, you have to see this. It's a homeless man playing piano, and it's incredible." Hartman had watched it on his granddaughter's phone, squinting at the small screen. The video quality was poor, the angle awkward, the rain creating visual noise, but the music was clear. And within 10 seconds, David Hartman knew exactly who was playing. He'd recognize that touch anywhere, the way Terrence approached Beethoven with reverence, but not rigidity, the way he let emotion guide his tempo. The distinctive way he voiced chords, giving slightly more weight to the inner voices than most pianists did. That was Terrence, his student, his friend. The young man he'd feared was lost forever. Hartman watched the video 17 times, tears streaming down his weathered face. Then he booked a train ticket to Philadelphia. He arrived Sunday afternoon and went directly to the location tagged in Emily's video. The piano was still there in the alley, rain-soaked and battered, a landmark now with flowers and notes left by people who'd been moved by the story. But Terrence wasn't there. Hartman was 72 and no longer moved quickly, but he was determined. He spent Sunday and Monday searching, talking to homeless advocacy groups, walking through the areas where Philadelphia's homeless population congregated. He showed Terrence's old Juilliard-trained photo, now 22 years outdated, asking everyone he met, "Have you seen this man?" On Monday evening, a social worker at the Arch Street soup kitchen studied the photo and nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think I know him. Goes by Terry. He comes here Tuesdays and Thursdays. Keeps to himself mostly." Tuesday evening, Hartman was waiting when the soup kitchen opened its doors. He stood to the side, scanning each face that entered, looking for the young man he'd known, though he knew that 5 years on the streets would have changed him. He was prepared for that. He wasn't prepared for the shock of recognition when Terrence finally walked through the door. The young man's face was gone, replaced by someone hollowed out by grief and hardship. Terrence had aged 20 years in 5, his face gaunt, his hair prematurely gray, his eyes carrying the weight of someone who'd seen the world end. He walked with the defeated posture of someone who'd learned to make himself small, to take up less space, to disappear. Hartman felt his heart break all over again. Terrence was moving through the serving line, accepting a tray of food when Hartman approached. He moved slowly, careful not to startle, and spoke gently. "Terrence." The man turned, and for a moment there was no recognition in his eyes, just the wariness of someone accustomed to strangers meaning trouble. Then, something shifted. His eyes widened. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The tray slipped from his hands, clattering to the floor, soup splashing across the linoleum. "Professor Hartman." The old man nodded, and Terrence stumbled backward like he'd been hit. His breathing became rapid and shallow. He looked around as if searching for an escape route, every muscle in his body tensed for flight. "It's okay," Hartman said quietly. "I'm not here to judge you, Terrence. I'm here because I saw the video. I'm here because I've been looking for you for 5 years. I'm here because you need to know something important." Terrence shook his head violently. I can't talk about this. I can't." "You played Thursday night." Hartman continued, his voice gentle but firm. "In an alley in the rain. Someone recorded it. Terrence, the whole world has seen it. The whole world has been looking for you." The words didn't seem to register. Terrence's eyes were wide with panic, his hands trembling. He looked like a man confronting a ghost, or maybe like a ghost confronting his own living past. "I shouldn't have played," Terrence whispered. "I promised myself. After Caleb, I promised I would never." His voice broke. Hartman stepped closer, ignoring the soup on the floor, ignoring the other people in the soup kitchen who had stopped to watch this strange reunion. "Music never gave up on you, Terrence. Even when you gave up on it. Even when you gave up on yourself. You don't understand." Terrence's voice was ragged. "Music was my life. Music was everything. And I was playing, I was happy. I was thinking about teaching Caleb a new song, and then he couldn't finish." The words dissolved into a sob he tried desperately to suppress. "I know," Hartman said. "I know about the accident. I know about Caleb. I know you've been carrying that weight alone. But Terrence, listen to me. That video has been viewed by 50 million people. 50 million. People around the world heard you play, and they were moved. They were changed. That performance, that moment of pain and beauty you created in that alley, it mattered. It matters. Terrence was crying now, tears streaming down his weathered face, his whole body shaking. I can't go back. I can't be that person again. He's dead. He died with my son. He's not dead, Hartman said quietly. He's standing right here in front of me. Scared, hurt, broken maybe, but alive. Your fingers remember Terrence. Your heart remembers. And Thursday night in that alley, you proved that the music never left you. You just had to stop running from it long enough to let it speak. The soup kitchen had gone completely silent. Everyone was watching, witnessing this moment, this confrontation between past and present, between who we were and who we've become. I don't know how to come back from this, Terrence finally whispered. I don't know how to live in a world without him. I know, Hartman said. But you're doing it anyway. You've been doing it for 5 years. The question isn't whether you can survive. You've proven you can. The question is whether you're ready to start living again. Hartman took Terrence to a diner 3 blocks from the soup kitchen. They sat in a corner booth. Terrence still shaking his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. He couldn't quite bring himself to drink. The professor ordered them both food, and for a long time, they just sat in silence, the weight of 5 years and a lifetime of memories pressing down on the table between them. Finally, Hartman pulled out his phone and showed Terrence the video. Terrence watched himself play, watched his own hands moving across those broken keys, watched the rain fall and the crowd gather. He saw the view count 73 million. He saw the comments, thousands and thousands of them, people from every corner of the world, sharing what the music had meant to them. I cried for an hour watching this. My mother has Alzheimer's, and music is the only thing that still reaches her. I played this for her, and she smiled for the first time in months. I was going to end my life tonight. Then I saw this video, and I remembered that beauty still exists in the world. This man is playing in an alley like some people can't play in concert halls. Terrence read them with tears streaming down his face, unable to process the magnitude of what had happened. He'd played for himself that night, for his own grief, for his own desperate need to feel something other than numbness. He'd had no idea anyone was watching, no idea it was being recorded, no idea that his private moment of breaking open would become public. It's too much, he whispered. I can't carry this. I can't be what they think I am. They don't think you're anything except honest, Hartman replied. That's what moved them. Not technical perfection, not flawless execution, authenticity, pain transformed into beauty. That's what great art is, Terrence. That's what you've always been able to do. Hartman set down his phone and pulled out a letter from his jacket pocket. The envelope was heavy, cream-colored formal. The return address made Terrence's breath catch Carnegie Hall. This arrived at Juilliard yesterday, Hartman said. Addressed to me, asking if I could help find you. They want you to perform Terrence. A special benefit concert proceeds going to homeless advocacy and mental health services. They're calling it Second Chances, an Evening of Hope. Terrence pushed the letter away like it was radioactive. No, absolutely not. I can't. You can. I haven't performed in 5 years. I'm not that person anymore. He gestured at himself, at his ragged clothes and unwashed hair, and the physical evidence of years on the streets. Look at me. I am looking at you, Hartman said firmly. I see a man who survived something that would have destroyed most people. I see a man who lost everything and kept breathing anyway. I see a man who played a broken piano in the rain and reminded the world why music matters. That's who I see. I'll fail, Terrence said. My hands shake. I drink. I have nightmares. I can't even sleep through the night without waking up screaming. How am I supposed to stand on a stage in front of thousands of people and pretend to be whole? You don't pretend to be whole, Hartman said. You show up broken. That's the whole point. Those people in the alley didn't watch a perfect performance. They watched a real one. That's what Carnegie Hall wants. That's what the world needs. Terrence shook his head, overwhelmed. What if I can't do it? What if I sit down at that piano and nothing comes out? What if I disappoint everyone? Then you disappoint them, Hartman said simply. But Terrence, what if you don't? What if you walk onto that stage and play the way you did Thursday night? What if you give those people the same gift you gave that crowd in the alley? What if you take your pain and your loss and your broken heart and you turn it into something that helps someone else carry theirs? The words hung in the air between them. Terrence looked down at his hands, these instruments that had betrayed him, by refusing to forget. He thought about Caleb, about the last conversation they'd had in the car, about the song his son wanted to learn. He thought about his grandmother, who'd sacrificed everything so he could have music lessons. He thought about the 5 years he'd spent trying to die slowly, and the fact that he was still here, still breathing, still carrying the weight. "I'm scared," he whispered. "I know," Hartman said. "Being scared means you still care. It means you're alive." "That's good." That night, Hartman got Terrence a hotel room, the first bed, with sheets he'd slept in for 5 years. He lay there in the darkness, clean for the first time in recent memory, warm for the first time in months, and he couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling and thought about Carnegie Hall, about the impossibility of it, about the terror and the hope tangled together so tightly he couldn't separate them. At 3 a.m., he called Hartman's cell phone. The old professor answered on the second ring, his voice alert, despite the hour, like he'd been waiting. "I need to talk to the people I used to live with," Terrence said. "Under the overpass. Before I decide, I need to talk to them." The next morning, Hartman drove Terrence back to the I-95 underpass. The residents were waking up, preparing for another day of survival. They saw Terrence arrive in a car with an old white man, and confusion rippled through the small community. Terrence stood before them, Raymond and Monica and Danny, and the others who'd been his only family for 5 years, and he told them everything. About Juilliard and Caleb and the accident, and the music, and the video, and Carnegie Hall. They listened in stunned silence. When he finished, Monica spoke first. "So you're leaving?" It wasn't a question. It was the sad acknowledgement that good things don't happen to people like them. And when they do, those people leave and never come back. "I don't know," Terrence said honestly. "I'm terrified. I don't know if I can do this." Raymond, the 62-year-old veteran who rarely spoke, cleared his throat. "I was in Vietnam," he said quietly. "Saw things I can't unsee. Did things I can't undo. Spent 40 years trying to drink them away. You know what I learned? Running doesn't make it smaller. It just means you're running. Maybe it's time to stop running." Danny, the kid who'd aged out of foster care, added, "You got a chance, man. How many of us get chances? You gotta take it, even if you're scared. Especially if you're scared." Monica walked up to Terrence and took his hands in hers. "You used to mutter in your sleep," she said. "I heard you night after night calling for Caleb, apologizing to him, telling him you were sorry. But baby, you got nothing to be sorry for. You survived. That's not a crime. And if you can take your survival and turn it into something that helps other people, something that honors your boy's memory, then you gotta do it. Not for them, for him." Terrence was crying again, these people who had nothing giving him everything they had. They hugged him one by one, and he felt their strength, their resilience, their stubborn refusal to give up despite a world that had given up on them. "If I do this," he said, "I'm coming back. I'm not forgetting where I've been. I'm not forgetting you." "We know," Raymond said. "Now go play some piano, man. Show them what we already knew. You're something special." In the car, driving back to the hotel, Terrence turned to Hartman and said 3 words. "I'll do it." Carnegie Hall set the concert date for 6 weeks away, giving Terrence time to prepare. It seemed both impossibly long and terrifyingly short. Hartman arranged everything. He got Terrence a small apartment in Philadelphia. He connected him with a therapist who specialized in PTSD and grief. He found him a sponsor through Alcoholics Anonymous. And most importantly, he got him access to a practice room with a proper piano. The first day, Terrence sat down at the Steinway Grand in the practice room. He couldn't make himself play. He sat on the bench for 2 hours, hands in his lap, staring at the keys like they might bite him. The piano in the alley had been different. Unexpected, a moment stolen from his carefully constructed defenses. This was intentional. This was choosing music, choosing life, choosing to risk his heart again. Hartman sat in the corner of the room, patient and silent. Finally, he spoke. "You don't have to be perfect, Terrence. You just have to be real." Terrence's hands found the keys. He played scales first, mechanical, and halting his fingers, remembering patterns from decades ago. Then exercises Hanon and Czerny, the building blocks of technique. Then slowly, carefully, he began to play real music. Chopin, Debussy, Beethoven. The rust fell away note by note, day by day, hour by hour. But the physical technique was only part of the battle. The real work was happening in the therapist's office, where Dr. Karen Williams guided Terrence through the landscape of his trauma with gentle persistence. They talked about Caleb, about the accident, about the guilt that had poisoned every moment since. "You're carrying survivor's guilt," Dr. Williams explained. "You believe you should have died instead of him. You believe you don't deserve to live, let alone to be happy or successful. So you've been punishing yourself by destroying everything good in your life." "Shouldn't I feel guilty?" Terrence asked. "I was driving. I'm his father. I was supposed to protect him. You were driving safely. Someone else's choice, someone else's criminal negligence caused that accident. You're not guilty of your son's death, Terrence, but you are guilty of abandoning yourself. And maybe it's time to stop." The AA meetings were harder than therapy. Sitting in a circle of strangers admitting powerlessness, confronting the ways he'd used alcohol to erase himself. But he kept going one day at a time, because the alternative was going back to the overpass, and he'd made a promise to Raymond and Monica and Danny. The media attention was overwhelming. News outlets wanted interviews. Documentaries were proposed. Publishing houses offered book deals. Hartman shielded Terrence from most of it, but he couldn't shield him from everything. The story had captured the public imagination. Homeless man goes viral, gets second chance, will perform at Carnegie Hall. It was the kind of redemption narrative that people hungered for, proof that rock bottom wasn't the end. But Terrence knew the truth was more complicated. He wasn't redeemed. He was just trying to practice, trying to stay sober, trying to sleep without nightmares, trying to believe he deserved this chance. 3 weeks before the concert, his hands started shaking badly during practice. Not the slight tremor of nerves, but violent shaking that made playing impossible. He tried to push through it, but the notes became crashes, the music becoming noise. He stood up from the piano, his heart racing, sweat pouring down his face. Panic attack. Hartman guided him through breathing exercises, staying calm, talking him down from the edge. When Terrence could speak again, he said, "I can't do this. It's too much. The expectations, the people watching, the chance of failure. I can't." "Then don't," Hartman said simply. "Call it off. Walk away. Go back to the overpass if that's what you need." Terrence looked at his old professor, shocked. "You'd let me quit?" "This isn't about me," Hartman said. "This is your life, Terrence. Your choice. If performing at Carnegie Hall is going to destroy you, then don't do it. But if you're just scared if you're running again because it's easier than facing the possibility of hope, then that's different. You have to decide which one it is. That night, Terrence couldn't sleep. He lay in his apartment in this bed that still felt foreign after years of sleeping on concrete, and he thought about Caleb. Not the accident, not the funeral, but before. The good memories he'd been too afraid to touch. Caleb laughing, Caleb playing with toy cars, Caleb's small hands reaching for the piano keys, his face scrunched in concentration as he tried to match the notes his father played. Caleb asking 1,000 questions. Caleb falling asleep on Terrence's chest, his breathing slow and steady and trusting. And Terrence realized something. He'd spent 5 years trying to honor Caleb's memory by destroying himself, by making his own life as small and painful as possible, as if suffering was love. But Caleb wouldn't want that. Caleb, who'd been 7 years old and full of joy and excitement about songs he wanted to learn, wouldn't want his father to spend the rest of his life punishing himself for being the one who survived. Maybe playing at Carnegie Hall wasn't about redemption. Maybe it was about remembering that life, even life stained with grief and loss, was still worth living. Maybe it was about taking the pain and making something from it, something that could reach another person in their darkness and remind them they weren't alone. The next day, Terrence returned to the practice room with new determination. His hands still shook sometimes. His concentration still wavered. He still woke up at night, reaching for a child who wasn't there. But he kept playing, kept working, kept choosing to stay. 2 weeks before the concert tickets went on sale. All 2,804 seats sold out in 4 minutes. The demand was so overwhelming that Carnegie Hall announced the concert would be live-streamed globally free of charge, so anyone could watch. 1 week before the concert, Terrence played through his entire program without stopping. 3 pieces: Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat, and Debussy's Clair de Lune. The same pieces he'd played in the alley that rainy night. When he finished, Hartman had tears in his eyes. "You're ready?" the old professor said. "No," Terrence replied, "but I'm going to do it anyway." The night before the concert, Terrence visited Caleb's grave for the first time since the funeral. He stood before the small headstone, reading the dates that contained a whole universe of love and loss, 2012 to 2019. 7 years. Such a small number. Such an enormous absence. "I'm sorry I haven't come before now," Terrence said to the cold stone. "I'm sorry for a lot of things, but tomorrow I'm going to play. I'm going to stand on a stage in front of thousands of people, and I'm going to be terrified, and my hands are going to shake, and I might fail completely. But I'm going to try. For you. For me. For everyone who's lost someone and doesn't know how to keep living. I hope that's okay." The wind picked up, rustling the leaves on the trees surrounding the cemetery. Terrence stood there for a long time, letting the grief wash over him. But this time he didn't try to run from it. He let it be what it was, love with nowhere to go, reaching across the boundary between life and death, still trying to protect and honor the child who'd made his world make sense. Then he went home and tried to sleep, knowing that tomorrow everything would change again. The green room at Carnegie Hall is surprisingly small and ordinary for a space that has held some of the greatest performers in history. Terrence sat on a worn couch wearing a tuxedo that Hartman had helped him pick out, staring at his hands. They were shaking. Not violently, but enough to notice enough to worry. Outside, 2,804 people were finding their seats. Around the world, millions more were logging into the live stream. The stage manager had informed him that the current estimate was 47 million people watching globally, and that number was still climbing. Hartman sat beside him, not speaking, just being present. Finally, Terrence said, "I think I'm going to be sick." "That's normal," Hartman replied. Horowitz used to vomit before every performance. "Anxiety doesn't mean you're not ready. It means you care." "What if I freeze? What if I sit down and can't remember how to play?" "Then you'll remember," Hartman said calmly. "Your hands know what to do. Your heart knows what to say. Trust them." The stage manager knocked on the door. "5 minutes, Mr. Brooks." Terrence stood up, his legs unsteady. He walked to the mirror and looked at himself. The man looking back was still a stranger, in some ways, this person wearing formal clothing preparing to perform at one of the world's most prestigious venues. But he was also familiar, a version of himself he'd thought was dead. "I wish you could see this," he said quietly. "Caleb, I wish he could see this. Maybe he can," Hartman said. "I'm not a religious man, but I believe that love doesn't end when life does. If there's any way he can see you, he's watching. And he's proud." They walked to the stage entrance together. Terrence could hear the murmur of the crowd, the shuffling of programs, the expectant silence that comes before a performance begins. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. The stage manager gave him a thumbs up. "Whenever you're ready, Mr. Brooks." Terrence took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. The spotlight hit him like a physical force, bright and hot and exposing. For a moment, he couldn't see anything beyond it, couldn't see the faces of the audience, couldn't see the back wall or the famous red and gold decor. He could only see the piano, a magnificent Steinway concert grand waiting for him. And then the audience began to applaud. It started scattered, a few people clapping, and then it built a wave of sound that grew and grew until it filled the entire hall. They were standing, all 2,804 of them, rising to their feet before he'd played a single note. Some were crying, some were holding up their phones recording this moment. Some just stood with their hands pressed over their hearts, witnessing the impossible. Terrence stood frozen at the edge of the stage, overwhelmed by the sight of all these people, by the weight of their expectations, and their hope, and their belief in this redemption story that felt too large for him to carry. His vision blurred with tears. The applause continued for 3 full minutes. When it finally began to fade, Terrence walked to the piano, each step requiring courage. He sat down on the bench, adjusted the height, placed his feet on the pedals. His hands hovered over the keys, shaking visibly. The hall fell silent. Terrence could hear his own breathing, could hear the pounding of his heart. Somewhere out there, Raymond and Monica and Danny were watching on a donated laptop under the overpass. Somewhere, Emily Roberts was crying in her living room. Somewhere, Alicia was watching his ex-wife, the woman who'd loved him and lost him. Somewhere, the world was holding its breath. And Terrence thought of Caleb. He thought of his son's small hands reaching for the piano, his excitement about learning new songs, his laugh that sounded like music. He thought of his grandmother, who'd believed in him. He thought of the 5 years he'd spent trying to die, and the unexpected grace of the piano in the alley, and the choice to try again. He let his hands fall to the keys. The opening notes of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata emerged into the silence, pure and clear and achingly beautiful. The first movement unfolded with its characteristic gentleness, each note perfectly weighted, each phrase shaped with emotional truth. Terrence wasn't playing for the audience. He wasn't playing for the cameras or the millions watching online. He was playing for the boy who would never hear him, the child whose absence was the silence between every note. The audience didn't breathe. They didn't move. They sat transfixed as this man who'd been homeless 6 weeks ago, this man who'd lost everything, poured his entire soul into Beethoven's meditation on longing and loss. The first movement gave way to the second, the tempo increasing, the technical demands escalating. Terrence's hands flew across the keys, no longer shaking, finding their strength in the music itself. The third movement erupted in passionate turmoil, the famous presto agitato that sounds like a storm breaking. Terrence played with controlled fury, with precision and power, his entire body engaged in the creation of sound. This was the music of a man fighting demons of beauty, struggling against darkness of hope, refusing to surrender to despair. When the final notes faded, the silence lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then the hall exploded with applause. The audience leapt to their feet, again shouting, crying, clapping until their hands hurt. The ovation lasted 7 minutes. People who'd attended concerts at Carnegie Hall for decades would later say they'd never witnessed anything like it. Terrence sat at the piano, tears streaming down his face, unable to process the magnitude of what had just happened. He'd done it. He'd walked onto this stage terrified and broken, and he'd played, and the music had been there waiting for him, like an old friend who'd never left. He stood and bowed the gesture, feeling inadequate for the emotion pouring from the audience. Then he sat back down and played Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat, this meditation on night and dreams and the beauty that exists in darkness. His touch was gentle now, intimate, like he was sharing a secret with everyone present. The final piece was Debussy's Clair de Lune, and Terrence played it like a prayer. The shimmering notes floated through the hall like moonlight on water, like hope finding its way through grief, like love that persists beyond death. By the final measures, there wasn't a dry eye in the audience. When he finished, the ovation was even longer than before. Terrence stood at the piano, looking out at the sea of faces, and he spoke for the first time. The microphones weren't set up for speech, but in the silence, his voice carried. "This concert is dedicated to my son, Caleb Brooks," he said, his voice breaking. "And to everyone who's lost someone they love and doesn't know how to keep going. The music doesn't have answers, but maybe it can sit with us in the questions. Maybe that's enough." The audience wept openly. They applauded again, and this time Terrence let himself receive it. Let himself feel the connection between his pain and their empathy, between his broken heart and their witnessing of it. Backstage, Hartman embraced him, and they both cried like children. "You did it," the old professor said. "My God, Terrence, you did it." But Terrence knew he hadn't done it alone. He'd done it carried by the memory of his son, supported by his old teacher, witnessed by the people under the overpass, who'd reminded him that survival was its own form of courage. He'd done it because music had refused to let him go, even when he'd tried so hard to let it go. The news coverage was immediate and global. Triumph at Carnegie Hall. Homeless pianist's emotional performance moves millions. The live stream peaked at 127 million concurrent viewers. Social media exploded with videos of the performance, with people sharing how it had affected them, how it had made them cry, how it had reminded them why art matters. But that night, after all the interviews and congratulations and overwhelming attention, Terrence went back to his small apartment alone. He sat in the quiet, still wearing his tuxedo, and he felt something he hadn't felt in 5 years. Peace. Not happiness, not yet, but peace. The acceptance that he could carry his grief and still create beauty, that he could miss Caleb every day for the rest of his life and still choose to live, that brokenness and wholeness could exist in the same person, in the same moment, in the same heart. The Carnegie Hall concert became a watershed moment, not just for Terrence, but for how society thinks about homelessness, mental health, and second chances. Within a week of the performance, the Second Chance Symphony Foundation was established, funded by donations that poured in from around the world. The foundation's mission was simple but revolutionary: to provide music education and instruments to people experiencing homelessness, to create pathways from streets to stages, to recognize that talent and dignity exist even in the most desperate circumstances. The first program launched in Philadelphia, where the piano in the alley was restored and placed in a community center, a monument to what's possible when art and empathy intersect. Within 3 months, similar programs appeared in 53 cities across the United States. In Chicago, a homeless woman named Diane, who'd been a professional cellist before addiction and domestic violence destroyed her life, got an instrument and a chance to perform again. In Los Angeles, a teenager named Marcus, who'd aged out of foster care, discovered he had an extraordinary voice and was connected with vocal training. In New York, a veteran named James, who'd lived in subway tunnels for 8 years, picked up a saxophone for the first time since his service and remembered who he used to be. Terrence became the face of the movement, though he was uncomfortable with the role. He didn't want to be a symbol or a spokesperson. He wanted to teach, to give back, to help other people find what he'd found in that alley. Juilliard created a special position for him, artist in residence for community engagement. He taught classes at the school, but he also taught weekly sessions at homeless shelters, soup kitchens, and community centers. His students ranged from children to elderly people, from those with formal training to those who'd never touched an instrument. He taught them with the same passion Professor Hartman had taught him, with patience and belief, and the understanding that music wasn't about perfection, but about truth. The ripple effects extended far beyond music. Terrence's story sparked conversations about mental health treatment, about how society treats people experiencing homelessness, about the systematic failures that allow talent and dignity to sleep under overpasses. City councils debated new policies. Mental health funding increased in several states. Veteran support programs were expanded. The Carnegie Hall concert was released as a live album, with all proceeds going to the foundation. It debuted at #1 on the classical charts and stayed there for 19 weeks. It won a Grammy. It was played in concert halls and classrooms and therapy sessions and hospitals around the world. But perhaps the most profound impact was the simplest people saw Terrence's story and recognized themselves in it. People who'd lost children, people who'd battled addiction, people who'd failed and fallen and given up. They saw this man who'd hit rock bottom and somehow found his way back, and they thought, maybe I can too. Maybe it's not too late. Maybe I deserve a second chance. The letters poured in, thousands of them, from people around the world, sharing their stories of loss and survival. Terrence tried to read them all. He couldn't, there were too many, but he tried. And he responded when he could, short notes of encouragement and understanding, one broken person reaching out to another. Emily Roberts, the teacher who'd recorded the original video, became an advocate for music education in underfunded schools. She started a non-profit that provided instruments to Title I schools, believing that the next Terrence Brooks might be sitting in a classroom somewhere, waiting for someone to believe in them. Raymond, Monica, and Danny, Terrence's friends from the overpass, all found housing and support through the foundation. Raymond got treatment for his PTSD and started volunteering at a veterans center. Monica enrolled in a community college to finish the degree she'd abandoned 20 years earlier. Danny got his GED and a job as a sound technician at a local theater. Alicia, Terrence's ex-wife, reached out 6 months after the concert. They met for coffee, the first time they'd spoken in years. It was awkward and painful and necessary. They talked about Caleb, really talked about him sharing memories instead of drowning in guilt. They cried together. They didn't get back together, too much had broken between them. But they found a kind of peace, a mutual understanding that they'd both survived the unsurvivable, just in different ways. The movement spread internationally. Programs based on the Second Chance Symphony model appeared in the UK, Canada, Australia, Japan, Brazil. In London, a homeless man named Thomas, who'd been a concert violinist, discovered his instrument again. In Toronto, a woman named Sarah, who'd lost everything to mental illness, found healing through the piano. In Sydney, a group of homeless musicians formed an orchestra that performed in parks and squares, bringing beauty to public spaces. The United Nations took notice. A special session on homelessness and arts accessibility was held with Terrence invited to speak. He stood before ambassadors and dignitaries still uncomfortable with the attention, and he told them the truth. Art didn't save me. People saved me. Professor Hartman, who didn't give up on me. The community under the overpass who showed me that dignity doesn't depend on circumstances. The stranger who recorded that video and shared it with the world. Art was the language we used, but love was the message. If we want to help people experiencing homelessness, we have to see them first. Really see them. Not as problems to be solved, but as human beings with stories and talents and worth. The speech was shared millions of times. It became required viewing in social work programs and music schools. It changed policy conversations from what do we do about homeless people to how do we support people experiencing homelessness in reclaiming their dignity and potential. 18 months after the Carnegie Hall concert, the Second Chance Symphony Foundation had helped over 12,000 people find pathways from homelessness to stability. Not all of them through music. Some discovered art, some theater, some writing, some coding. The point wasn't the medium. The point was recognition support belief. And at the center of it all was Terrence Brooks, who still woke up some mornings reaching for a son who wasn't there, who still cried when he played certain pieces, who still carried the weight of loss every single day. But he also laughed sometimes. He also felt joy when a student mastered a difficult passage. He also allowed himself to believe that his life, despite its tragedy, had meaning. He performed occasionally always benefit concerts for causes related to homelessness or mental health or music education. But he was most comfortable teaching, working one-on-one with students who needed someone to believe in them the way Hartman had believed in him. 2 years after the rainy night that changed everything, Terrence returned to the alley behind the Walnut Street Theater. The piano was gone now, moved to the community center, where it had been restored and made available to anyone who wanted to play it. But the alley remained the bricks the same, the smell of rain and possibility the same. He stood there in the darkness, remembering the man he'd been that night, the desperate, broken person who'd stumbled upon an abandoned instrument and made a choice he didn't fully understand. He thought about how different everything was now, how impossible it would have seemed then that he'd be standing here not as a homeless man, but as someone with an apartment and students and purpose. But he also thought about how much was the same. He still missed Caleb with an ache that never fully faded. He still had nightmares. He still struggled some days to believe he deserved good things. Healing wasn't linear. Recovery wasn't a destination, but a daily choice. A sound made him turn. A young woman was standing at the entrance to the alley, maybe 19 or 20, holding a violin case. She looked uncertain, like she wasn't sure she belonged. "Is it true?" she asked quietly. "This is where it happened. Where you played?" Terrence nodded. "Yeah, 2 years ago." Right here. I'm homeless, she said, the words tumbling out quickly, defensively. I've been on the streets for 6 months. I used to play violin, but I pawned mine for food. I saw your story and I thought... She trailed off, uncertain. What's your name? Terrence asked gently. Jessica. Have you been to the community center? Jessica. The one on 3rd Street? She shook her head. I don't belong in places like that. I'm not good enough. I'm not like you. Terrence walked closer, and he saw himself in her eyes, the shame and fear and desperate hope. 2 years ago, I was sleeping under an overpass. I was drinking myself to death. I believed I deserved nothing. And then I touched a piano because I was too tired to keep running. That's all this is, being too tired to keep running from the things that make us feel alive. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a card for the Second Chance Symphony Foundation. Go to this address tomorrow. Tell them I sent you. There are instruments. There are teachers. There are people who will see you, really see you, not as a problem, but as a person with worth and talent and a story that matters. Jessica took the card with trembling hands. What if I've forgotten how to play? You haven't, Terrence said with certainty. Your hands remember. Your heart remembers. It's all still there, waiting for you to stop being afraid of it. She nodded, tears in her eyes, and then she walked away into the night, clutching the card like a lifeline. Terrence stood in the alley a while longer, thinking about the strange architecture of grace, how we stumble into salvation when we least expect it, how broken things can still make beautiful sounds. He thought about the keys of the piano, 88 black and white possibilities, waiting patiently for fingers to bring them to life. He thought about Caleb. Always Caleb, his sweet boy, who would have been 9 years old now, who would have been learning more complex pieces, whose life had been cut short by someone else's terrible choice. The grief would never leave entirely. Terrence had learned to accept that, but it had transformed, becoming something he could carry instead of something that carried him. And he thought about tomorrow, about the students he'd teach, about the people he'd help, about the slow, imperfect work of turning pain into purpose, of using brokenness as a bridge to connect with other broken people. Sometimes the most profound transformations begin not with grand plans or perfect circumstances, but with a single moment of courage, a decision to touch the keys of possibility one more time, even when your hands are shaking, even when you're terrified, even when you've forgotten what music sounds like. The rain started falling again, gentle this time, a whisper instead of a storm. Terrence turned up his collar and walked out of the alley, leaving the past behind him, while carrying it forward, a man still learning how to live with loss, still learning how to forgive himself, still learning that sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply showing up and choosing to play. The alley was empty now, dark and quiet, just bricks and rain and shadows, but it held a story, one that had traveled around the world, one that had reminded millions of people that worth isn't determined by circumstances, that talent can exist anywhere, that second chances are possible, even when we're certain we don't deserve them. And somewhere in the city, in the community center where the restored piano waited, someone else would sit down tomorrow and touch the keys, beginning their own journey from silence to song, from despair to hope, from forgetting to remembering who they truly are. The music never stops, Terrence thought, as long as someone is brave enough to play.